we're going to need a web server, and that's going to serve up the web pages to our end users, obviously, across the internet. But we're also going to need to be running a web server on our computer to serve those same web files to our local browser on our development machine that will mimic the same behavior that we would have as if we were out on the internet. Then we'll need Ruby, the programming language, because our computer will obviously need to understand Ruby if it's going to work with Rails. And Rails will be the next thing that we need to install, all the files that make Rails framework do what it does best. We'll need a database, because ultimately we want to connect Rails to a database. And of course we'll need a text editor and a web browser that we can edit our files in and then view the results that come back from the web server. Now for me, my configuration today will be using the WebBrick web server. Now WebBrick is a web server you might not be familiar with. It's very small, lightweight, easy to configure, and it ships with Rails. So by installing Rails, we're automatically going to have WebBrick installed. And that's why we're going to use it. It works really well for Rails development, even though in actual production, I tend to use Apache. I'm going to be using Ruby version 1.8.4. As I mentioned earlier, there are other versions out there. There's even a newer version, but 1.8.4 is the stable and preferred release at this point. And I'm going to be using Rails version 1.1.6. 1.2 is due out in early 2007, so you might already have that, and that's fine too. That won't cause any problems. For the database, I'm going to be using MySQL. That's an open source and free database. It's very popular and a lot of people like it. You certainly could be using something else. For the text editor, I'll be using TextMate. TextMate's a fairly new text editor, and it's gained a lot of traction in the Rails community because it has a lot of nice features that works well with Rails developers, and we'll see those as we go on. And for the web browser, I'll be using Firefox. Now, you certainly could be using different things than me. If you're using Safari for your web browser or Internet Explorer, you can use Notepad or BBEdit for your text editor. You could even use something like Postgres for your database. But don't worry if your configuration is slightly different from mine. Incidentally, I'm not arbitrarily picking this configuration and these applications to run because I prefer them, even though I do. While the Rails community is vast and varied, most Rails developers are using a similar configuration for development, even though they may end up deploying to something like Linux. A good starting point for downloading is the Ruby on Rails website, and we're going to go there now. So here I am in Firefox with rubyonrails.org brought up in my browser, and I'm going to go to the first link here, which is the Get Started link. This page, rubyonrails.org/down, is the download and install page, and it will always contain up-to-the-minute instructions on how to get Ruby on Rails installed on your machine. So if you have a machine that's slightly different from mine, this is a great place to come and find out how to get it configured for your system. It's also a great place to come if the instructions that I give you become out of date, because this will always be constantly revised and kept up to date, so you can always be sure you're getting current instructions by coming to this page. If you're a Windows user, this page will also give you instructions, but I wanted to point you to another resource as well. There's a single package installer for Windows called Instant Rails, and by just running this one installer, you can get everything that you need to get up and running. Instant Rails includes Ruby, Rails, MySQL, and all the connecting parts that you're going to need, as well as the WebBrick web server. Now, the one thing I want to note is that if you do decide to go with Instant Rails, that Instant Rails has its own console. And we'll talk more about what a console is later, but that's the command line interface that you're going to be using to enter commands. Now, Windows has its own console as well, but if you install Instant Rails, you want to make sure that you're using the Instant Rails console for everything that you do. If you're installing this on a Macintosh, like me, the first thing you'll want to do is check your version number, and I'll show you how to do that now. If you go up to the Apple in the upper left corner, and you pull down to About This Mac, it'll pop up and tell you that you're running Macintosh OS X version 10.4.8. Now, your version may be different than mine. You'll also see that the software update button is below it, and that'll help you to get your operating system fully updated. Now, if you're a Mac user, based on those numbers that we just saw for the version number, there are three possibilities. If you have macOS 10.4.5 or earlier, then you're going to need to install everything, and I'm going to walk you through that in the next several movies. If you have Mac version 10.4.6 or later, you're already going to have Ruby and MySQL installed, and you'll just need to install Ruby Gems and Rails. However, I want to mention to you that if you do run into any problems with your installation, which you already have installed, or if you run into problems during the installation, it's no problem to go back and do the installation over again. It can't hurt. So if you run into problems, that's always going to be a good fallback for you. And finally, there's some very good news for Mac users. If you have Mac OS X Leopard, that's the code name for the new Mac operating system that's due out sometime around spring of 2007 or something later than that, then you're going to have everything installed. That's Ruby, Rails, Gems, MySQL, Apache. Everything will come right out of the box. And that's a really exciting development for the Rails community because right out of the box, you'll be able to get Ruby on Rails running with no headaches at all. Mac users also have another option, and that's a one-click installer as well, the single package installer called Locomotive. And you can get that at the URL that I've shown there. Now, while an all-in-one package might at first seem attractive and much easier than the steps that I'm going to walk you through, there are two major caveats that I want to give you. Locomotive uses SQLite as its database, and LiteTPD is a web server. If you're comfortable with SQLite and LiteTPD, then go for it. But this tutorial is going to assume that you're using MySQL and the Rails built-in WebBrick server, so you'll be on your own to make the necessary adjustments. If you're a Linux user, then you can find help on this Ruby on Rails download page, and there are also a number of other tutorials down there that can help you out. In truth, the installation is not so different from the Macintosh installation, and if you're an expert Linux user, then you may be able to follow along with my Mac instructions and still get the job done. The key points to remember are that you really need 4 essential items. And that's the web server, Ruby, Rails, and a database. And once you get all 4 of those installed and up and running, then you'll be in good shape no matter what system you're on. So now that we've gone through an overview of the installation process we're going to have, let's get started with installation.